West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
There's been a lot of talk from the right, particularly the Trump wing, about how Donald Trump was so tough on Russia and that Russia didn't invade Ukraine while he was president. But on Meet the Press yesterday, former President Trump's chief advisor on Russia, Fiona Hill, explained why it is what Trump said on that perfect phone call with President Zelensky that matters so much. Take a look.
Well, certainly there was an awful lot done by the administration, also by Congress and by Ambassador Haley herself at the United Nations. But I think that just the one point that sums everything up that you yourself touched on is that President Trump, at a pretty critical period, withheld military assistance to Ukraine that was desperate for it at that particular juncture, basically to get Volodymyr Zelensky to do him a personal favour.
And what message does that send to Putin?
Well, that sends a message to Putin that Ukraine is a plaything for himself as well and for the United States, and that nobody's really serious about protecting Ukraine. And that was ultimately a sign of weakness. It's our political divisions, our partisan infighting, which was on full display there, that Putin, I think, is quite shocked now that we've got some collective action together.
Maureen Dowd's latest piece for the New York Times really kind of breaks it down. It's entitled Zelensky and Trump, Two Performers, One Hero. And she writes in part, quote, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky both played leaders on TV shows and then became leaders in real life. But after they ascended to power, they took on very different roles. Trump became a blackguard. Zelensky donned a white hat. Trump tried to overturn American democracy. Zelensky tried to save Ukrainian democracy. Trump, in a nimbus of selfishness and narcissism, inverted revered American ideals. He soiled the image of his country and reshaped it around his grievances and inadequacies. Zelensky stood up for Ukrainian ideals. He helped imbue his country with a shining, resilient image, reinforced when the world saw remarkable images of battle-ready mothers and grannies making Molotov cocktails. By standing up to the evil empire, Zelensky could earn comparisons to another performer turned Pole, and that should grate on Trump as much as having his vice president turn on him. Ronald Reagan helped lift the Iron Curtain. Zelensky is trying his best to stop it from slamming down again. Let's bring in editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick, and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Emma Ashford. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Good to have you all with us this morning.
David, I wanted to go back to something that Fiona Hill said, and that is Vladimir Putin's miscalculation from paying too much attention to Donald Trump and the Trump years. This weekend, one of my children said they had never really seen what they're seeing now in class, and that is where people on both sides of the ideological divide, they're no longer debating in social studies two completely different views of the world. She said people are all telling the stories that they're picking up from Ukrainian social media. They're talking about the sunflower seed story. They're talking about the ads. It's really an extraordinary moment, and one that Vladimir Putin and, quite frankly, a lot of Americans probably could not have foreseen. A unified America and a unified NATO.
Well, up to a point, because
right.
Donald Trump doesn't seem part of that unity. For years, we have been quoting Donald Trump on himself, how he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and he would still survive politically. It seems to me axiomatic that Donald Trump's behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine, by, as Fiona Hill said, making Ukraine a plaything, a source of a bribe to enhance his political career, and now calling Putin a genius and showing great admiration for him, then trying to walk that back and talk about having a war with China and Russia. If this doesn't prove him to be not only a fool, and someone who knows nothing about world affairs and cares less, but somebody who's incredibly malevolent about the interests of his own country and the interests of a country trying to ward off invasion, a democratically elected leader trying to ward off invasion. If that doesn't end Donald Trump's political aspirations to run again in 2024, then we as America are truly lost. Truly lost. You can't compare his behavior, his foolishness, his idiocy, and his malevolence to anybody else who's held that office in American history.
Let's talk about Russian history. I had read from Dr. Brzezinski, an essay he wrote in '83, describing the Soviet Union in 1983 that sounded an awful lot like Vladimir Putin. Admiral Stavridis came on and said, "I will see your 1983 Soviet Union and raise you Peter the Great." Basically talking about an unbroken line in Russian history, from the Tsars all the way to Vladimir Putin, and perhaps Americans shouldn't be quite so shocked. I'm curious, as a man who's dedicated so much of your life to studying Russia and Russian leaders, are we seeing something new with Vladimir Putin, something uniquely meddlesome, or is this just a continuation?
Well, I don't see it as an unbroken line, because I think it'd be hard to compare Mikhail Gorbachev to Putin or to Stalin. These are very, very different temperaments who saw the interests of their countries in a very, very different way. I think, what we're talking about in terms of Putin is courage. That to me seems to be a theme that we have to emphasize. Yes, there are all kinds of historical currents at work here and economic currents at work here, but we're seeing in Zelensky the enormous historical importance of individual courage to therefore inspire a nation. That is important. And where are we going to see courage coming out of Russia? Your previous guests were talking about the oligarchs and so on. These oligarchs are wealthy at the sufferance of Putin. So many people owe their positions and their wealth solely to one man, not to a system, not to a constitution, not to their own efforts, but their ability to get close to the great leader and to curry favor with him. And it is going to be extremely important to see who, and Mike McFaul, I think, had this right, who defects from this system, who says, I'm willing to put up all my millions and my privileges and my power, and I'm going to say no more. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a very important thing in the days and weeks to come.
Emma, I think you've been making such an important point that our viewers, I think you'd really help our viewers understand the Cold War. When people talk about a return to the Cold War, you say that when they're talking about the return to the Cold War, they're probably thinking about late in the Cold War when we had certain safeguards in place, and not the far more dangerous early phases of the Cold War, which we've all heard from our parents, about that week during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people were concerned that nuclear annihilation was just around the corner. Do you suggest that what we're looking at now perhaps is a return to those earlier parts of the Cold War where we didn't have all those safeguards in place?
So it's not a perfect metaphor, right? Nobody should assume we're going back to something that's going to look exactly like the Cold War. There's a lot of differences. But again, we saw that Maureen Dowd column. She's talking about, Reagan and is Zelensky a metaphor for Reagan? And we're all thinking about that period at the end of the Cold War when arms control negotiations yielded a lot of diplomatic progress. And we actually saw this sort of flowering in US-Russian cooperation and relations. The more analogous period, I think, to what we're seeing today is the late 1940s, the early 1950s, when we see the series of crises, the Berlin crisis, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, each of which had that nuclear dimension and each of which could have gone wrong very badly. And those crises are the reason why the superpowers started to engage in arms control over the following decades. And so, I am worried that the period that we're heading into with Russia is going to be that much more unmanaged crisis where we might see escalation.
And the late 40s, early 50s would seem to be more analogous to now because, of course, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had members of the Politburo concerned by Khrushchev's actions, by his reaction, and actually he got pushed aside. So there, even with Khrushchev, you actually had checks and balances, which with Putin just doesn't seem to be there, does it?
No, it's a much more centralized administration in Russia. But the other lesson that I think we should take from those crises is that U.S. leaders were often willing to negotiate with Russia to perhaps give some concessions on our side in order to get concessions on the Russian side. So Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example. We often interpret this as Kennedy, was tough with the Russians and won, but actually we made concessions about Jupiter missiles, in Turkey. So there are ways to take lessons from the Cold War that might help us de-escalate things.
David, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think you make a very important point, and that is that under Brezhnev, yes, Brezhnev was the general secretary of the Communist Party, but he was surrounded by a Politburo that had real power. Same with Khrushchev. The reason Khrushchev was overturned, the reason he was kicked out, and you get this in Khrushchev's memoirs, is that he was surrounded by people who disagreed with him and wanted him out, and they acted. You do not have necessarily that dynamic here, and it's certainly, and you should tell yourself this every time you hear people predicting this on television, it's certainly not visible to us. So the power dynamics at the very top of the Kremlin are so invisible that the metaphor of him sitting at the end of a 30-foot table, separated from not only foreign visitors, but his own aides, that is a metaphor that should tell you a little bit about the isolation and the personalization of the regime that exists in Russia today and the way decisions are made.
It is Tuesday, the 8th of March of 2022, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef. And our daily special is Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. A small scant dash, a mere pinch of hot smoked Hungarian paprika could make all the difference in the world. You know it could. Well, how are you on this fine Tuesday? The war continues apace. Any of those humanitarian corridors that Vlad wants to set up, I keep telling everybody that just is a free fire zone. Don't do it. Every time they set these up, this is worse than Lucy. They put them in this corridor and they start shelling the civilians. Civilians! On purpose. I guess it's to demoralize the population so they'll just give up to the Nazis in Germany, because that is what this is about, you know. The one thing that we do not speak about is how anti-Semitism is driving this. How is that? Well, if you want to know a little bit of Russian history, did you know that the Protocols of Zion were written in Russia? And that right now, Vladimir Putin could be considered an author? I'm just saying. All right. How does this work, this conspiracy work, that it's some sort of Nazi, I don't know, whatever, right? Is that it's a conspiracy against Russia by the Jews. Because according to these conspiracy theorists, in Russia, where the Protocols of Zion were written, the Jews blaming anything is just them trying to draw attention to the atrocities that Russians have had to put up with. So Zelensky being a Jew is just proof that the Jewish takeover, the cabal and all of them are trying to take over everything. Denazify Ukraine. Give me a break. When they say denazify, they mean get rid of the Jewish people. And it's so bad there that, a lot of people from this former Soviet Union hightailed it to Israel when they were allowed to. I mean, the state of Israel was created because they weren't necessarily allowed to leave a gulag in Siberia during Stalin's reign or others, even Khrushchev. Anti-Semitism is so rampant there. It's systemic, but you cannot call it systemic. It is a mirror of how our civil rights experience has been with people of color. And I would say the Jewish population as well, overall. But the racism, the bigotry, the hate directed towards the Jewish diaspora, specifically in Russia right now, as we're speaking of them, is what is animating this takeover of Ukraine. Because some Jewish guy got raised to the level of a leader. And now look at him. Everybody's calling him Churchill. Yeah, well, you F around, you'll find out, right? That's how the world works. Sometimes under pressure, those who you think would be able to get us through it fall utterly, completely to pieces. While others, like some jokester, won a dance competition for the European Dancing with the Stars, or was it Ukrainian Dancing with Stars? Regardless, Zelensky won that. And here he is, and he's like Hitler and maybe even Alexander the Great. Probably about the same height. I don't know, maybe not. Every time we see depictions of Alexander the Great, there's all these like giant Greeks around him, and the giant Greeks are about 6'1", because back in the day, right, proportion was valued differently. Oh, he's big. He's about 6'1". What? That sounds like average to me. That's why I'm so average. Anyway, we cannot discount the anti-Semitism that is driving this, that is motivating this, that is what the reason for this takeover. Vladimir Putin is an anti-Semite, and we need to remember that. If that's insulting to him, good. He needs to be insulted. And I will just say, once again, the whole idea about keeping rural America and rural Russia uneducated, ill-informed, is so that they can get away with what they're getting away with right now. Is it a wonder why they want homeschooling in the hinterlands in both countries? I mean, it's so bad that daughters are showing the actual shelling on their cell phones to their brainwashed moms who say that's not happening. You're just making it up. And the daughter's going, Mom, this is your effing, war. This is what you people destroyed my home. Live on her cell phone. And Mom still wouldn't believe it. Her own daughter. Okay. But it's we liberals who don't know how to govern. It's we liberals that can't be entrusted with security. It's we liberals that can't be entrusted with economics. It's we liberals that cannot govern. cannot have a place, cannot have a say. We hear about all these whiny-ass conservative students saying, oh, I'm being canceled. I can't have an opinion. I can't voice my opinion. And I keep thinking about Schwerner. I keep thinking about all the lynching, the Freedom Riders. I keep thinking about Fred Hampton. Don't talk to me about being canceled out, that you don't have an ability to voice an opinion. It's your opinion that's causing all this death and destruction. All right. I didn't have conservative friends in college or university for that matter. I mean, yeah, I knew some people, but I wouldn't consider them friends. And the reason I didn't consider them friends is because they were the ones who vandalized the campus. They were the ones who, started fights at parties, for instance. And also harassed co-eds walking by. You know, hanging out their second and third story dorm windows. And we had some pretty good dorms back in the day. Hell, frat boys, that was just a given. If you were a gal, you didn't want to walk by the frat house. If you were a co-ed, unless you wanted to go to the parties, that's what you had to do. And when you're young and in college, you do foolish things, don't you? Yeah. But it's a training ground for some types. And that wasn't the kind of training that I was actually wanting to be in training for. I had some different aspirations, and that wasn't belittling my contemporaries. Well, unless, I don't know, even in writing classes, it seemed like writing classes were, and writing workshops were a place where you could just let it all hang out, just rip your fellow writers a new one. I hated that. I liked the classes and workshops where it was uplifting, where the participants in the class or the workshop were, helpful. They were they were generous with praise, and the criticism was one of construction to make it better, rather than pointing a finger and snickering. You wrote that. Okay, I hated those contentious aspects of the workshops and the classes. And you know who were the willing participants to do that? To tear your fellow student a new one? Yeah. Uh-huh. And don't tell me libertarians are liberals, please. Just because it starts with the first three letters. Okay, 4. What? Oh my gosh. Tuesday. It's already Tuesday. It feels like Thursday to me. And did you know we have to spring ahead on Sunday morning? Damn. I used to enjoy the time changes. When I was a little kid, going to school in Klamath Falls, Oregon, we had to come down from the mountain where the university is. Oregon Technical Institute, yeah. Anyway, it was back in the day, it was Oregon Institute of Technology. OTI. Yeah, now it's Oregon Institute of Technology. Wait! Back in the day, it was OTI. But we would be bused down the mountain to the town of Klamath Falls. And the bus would pick us up in the dark, and then we would be transported back home to the campus where my birth dad, my natural dad, my real dad, what is it? Anyway, he was attending the university then, and we lived in student family housing or family student housing. How's that work? So get home, and it would be dark. And when they changed the time, I remember that. When they finally changed the time, I got at least one of those trips in the sun. I thought, God, this is great. Now that I'm old, I don't want to lose or gain an hour. My animals don't care. The plants don't care. Everything stays on the same time frame. God, don't do this to me. Oh, well, so Sunday, remember, spring ahead. Okay, well, we might as well get into the curated part of the show because we should. I mean, we take the effort and time to call the universe of news. so that we can have a little salon here with our repast. All right. On the rest of the menu here, as we begin in the Bistro Cafe, of course, the lessons of the Cold War could help us de-escalate the war in Ukraine. It could. A proposed EPA rule would make heavy trucks cut its smog and soot pollution. I believe that means not the heavy trucks themselves, but the manufacturers. The Supreme Court turned away efforts from Republicans in North Carolina and Pennsylvania to block state court-ordered congressional district maps. What's scary, though, is that all they have to do is get Kavanaugh on board, and it's a totally different story, because actually Kavanaugh, even though he voted with a majority, would have been with the dissenters. Yeah, Alito. God, I hate that guy. Gorsuch. I hate that guy. Thomas. Who doesn't hate that guy? And President Joe Biden is expected to sign an executive order on regulating cryptocurrency, and it couldn't happen too soon since, well, Russia's trying to circumvent sanctions by, yeah, you know it, getting into a Ponzi scheme. Maybe that would be a good idea. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where the United States and 10 other countries condemned North Korea's latest ballistic missile launch. Yeah, while there's a war going on, North Korea's still rattling its sabers. And the U.S. assured the nervous Baltics of NATO protection against Russia, even though that might start World War III. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. Bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is the chat room link, and the chat room is monitored by Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly, for doing so. To the left of the chat room link, across the page there, well, near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com is the link to our Patreon page. And please do become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio. If you could afford an espresso-type coffee drink, and if you could afford to send those funds to us once a month, we are able to stretch those dollars beyond compare, which then allows us to pay our bills, and they keep increasing, and also the continuous upgrades of software and hardware that has and must be done, because we have some longevity here in wearing things out. Almost 11 years. And that generosity of sending us those funds once a month sustains us, as it has these so many years. And thank you for your generosity. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, do so at Netroots Radio. Tom takes care of that. Thank you, Tom. Follow me on Twitter at Justice Putnam. All one word, by the way. And I post the show notes and links diary. Incidentally, I post that on Daily Codes about 10 minutes before showtime, and then get that posted up on Twitter and other social media platforms. Of course, as you know, the show notes and links are where you can find the real reportage, because that's where the real reportage is. Nothing's fake here. Okay, might be embellished, but not fake. If you would like to follow the show on Twitter, it's easy. You can do so at Cookbook West. I don't know. I don't do a whole lot there, but it's there, and you can follow us there. And you can also, most importantly, pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, etc. And the Netroots Radio, where also West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy can be found in the deep archive of such at the Internet Archive at archive.org. Okay, look for us there. We're still posting shows that we produced and had coming through almost 11 years of Netroots Radio. And they're there, and we're posting more as we go along, because it's a lot of work. Is it ever? All right, this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy on this fine Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays is out of the Associated Press by Tom Kreischer. The Biden administration is proposing stronger pollution regs for new tractor-trailer rigs that would clean up smoky diesel engines and encourage new technologies during the next 2 decades. I remember when they used to say diesel is a clean energy because the particulates are so big it just falls down and, like coats your cars and your lawns and your houses. Oh, thank you. Much cleaner. The proposal, released yesterday, Monday, by the EPA, would require the industry to cut smog and soot-forming nitrogen oxide emissions by up to 90% per truck over current standards by 2031. Now, of course, the emissions can cause respiratory problems in humans, but what does that do to jobs? New rules would start in 2027 to limit the emissions from nearly 27 million heavy trucks and buses nationwide. They're trying to take jobs away from people just because people need to breathe. Although truck manufacturers are working on battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell powertrains, the EPA says the proposal is not a zero-emissions truck requirement. Rather, the agency says there are pollution control devices in development that can keep diesels in use and still clean the air. The EPA also is drawing up stronger limits for heat-trapping greenhouse gas emissions. Current standards would be updated starting in 2027, and stronger new standards would begin in 2030. Requirements were last updated in 2001, with the next big step coming in 2024. And that is why elections matter. Sherman of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. In a victory for Democrats, the Supreme Court has turned away efforts from Republicans in North Carolina and Pennsylvania to block state court-ordered congressional districting maps. In separate orders late yesterday, Monday, the justices are allowing maps selected by each state Supreme Court to be in effect for the 2022 elections. Those maps are more favorable to Democrats than the ones drawn by the state's legislatures, only in that they are more fair to everybody. Let's be clear, the Republican maps were gerrymanders. God. In North Carolina, the map most likely will give Democrats an additional House seat in 2023, only because people get to vote finally. Maybe. We'll still have to see if they have a place to drop off their votes. The Pennsylvania map also probably will lead to the election of more Democrats, the Republicans say, as the two parties battle for control of the U.S. House of Representatives in the midterm elections in November. In other words, a fight for democracy itself. The justices provided no explanation for their actions, as is common in emergency applications on what is known as the shadow docket. While the court did not stop the state court-ordered maps or plans from being used in this year's elections, and this is where it gets dicey, 4 conservative justices indicated they want it to confront the issue that could dramatically limit the power of state courts over federal elections in the future, which is the exact opposite of what they've been arguing for all along until they keep losing. The Republicans argued that state courts lack the authority to second-guess legislatures' decisions about the conduct of elections for Congress and the presidency. In other words, when we say we want to, use this fraudulent document to overturn an election, our legislature says it can do that. Wow. The state courts were involved because of partisan wrangling and lawsuits over congressional redistricting in both states where the legislatures are controlled by Republicans. The governors are Democrats, and the state Supreme Courts have Democratic majorities, and everywhere a Republican legislator is, they try to neuter the Democratic governor, and wherever there's a Republican governor, they try to neuter the Democratic legislatures. It is a fight for democracy. Representative democracy itself. Fatima Hussein and Amir Madhani of the Associated Press brings us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. President Joe Biden is expected to sign an executive order on cryptocurrency this week that will mark the first step toward regulating how digital currency is regulated and traded. The move comes as administration officials have raised concerns in recent weeks about Russia's use of cryptocurrency to evade the impact of crushing sanctions in response to its invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions have sent the ruble to historic lows and have closed the country's stock market. Two people familiar with the process said the EO on cryptocurrency was expected to be issued this week, and it had been in the works long before the war. Both people spoke on condition that they not be named to preview the order, because they always do that. The order is expected to describe what government agencies, including Treasury, need to do to develop policies and regulations on digital currencies. It is expected to include a request for the State Department to ensure that American cryptocurrency laws are aligned with those of U.S. allies, and will ask the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which monitors the stability of U.S. financial system, to study illicit finance concerns. Indeed. Well, let's get to our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
Hi, and welcome to COVID Quickly, a Scientific American podcast series.
This is your fast-track update on the COVID pandemic. We bring you up to speed on the science behind the most urgent questions about the virus and the disease. We demystify the research and help you understand what it really means.
I'm Tanya Lewis.
I'm Josh Fishman.
And we're Scientific American's senior health editors. Today, we'll explain the new official methods to determine if you're in a pandemic safe zone or danger area.
Then we'll discuss what other pandemics looked like when they were ending, and whether this one, at long last, is heading down a similar path.
The map of the U.S. shifted last week, or at least the map of COVID danger did. Suddenly, a lot of hazardous regions were deemed safer. What happened, Josh? Did COVID disappear?
It was a weird moment, Tanya, and no, COVID hasn't gone away. But last Friday morning, people looked at an official Centers for Disease Control map showing much of the nation was in a high-risk area. And the next day, that map showed about 60% of the U.S. was really at low or medium risk. And people in those areas didn't need to wear a mask anymore, the agency said. What happened was three things. One, now we have more tools to keep people safer, such as vaccinations and new antiviral drugs. Two, we are seeing fewer infections as we slide down from the scary Omicron wave, though about 2,000 Americans are still dying every day, and none of us should tolerate that level of death. And three, because of the first two, the CDC decided to recalculate how it measured COVID risk. That's what changed the map. In the old scheme, the agency used only case counts in a particular county. 100 cases or more per 100,000 meant high risk of virus transmission, and the CDC said people in those places should wear masks. The new scheme shifts the calculation to measures of severe disease. It emphasizes the number of new hospital admissions and how much of a hospital is filled with existing COVID patients. And it still includes case counts, but it ups the levels for high risk to 200 for every 100,000 people. The agency has a tracker where you can check whether your community is at low, medium, or high risk. Public health experts generally applauded the move. People can usually deal with mild illness, but getting sick enough for an emergency trip to the hospital is what everyone wants to avoid. Also, we need to stop overwhelming the healthcare system with COVID patients. Case counts rise ahead of hospitalizations, so keeping them in the mix provides communities with early warnings. If a community rises to high risk, the new guidelines explain how to dial up protection measures, says Caitlin Jedalina, an epidemiologist at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. Masks should go back on, and people should stay out of buildings with poor ventilation, and there should be a push for more vaccinations and booster shots. When the warning indicators drop, measures can be dialed back down. However, Jedalina is unhappy about the 200 cases allowed before a community moves to high risk. With people getting long COVID and only about a quarter of children aged 5 through 11 fully vaccinated, she thinks this level of transmission is still unsafe. And if more people go without masks, with even a moderate transmission rate in their area, it endangers people with weakened immune systems. But the U.S. wants to push towards pre-pandemic normal, and government policies are following that line. This week, the White House announced a series of plans for getting there while COVID stays around. There will be test and treat facilities at local pharmacies and community centers where people can get rapid tests and antiviral medications. The government also wants to step up surveillance for new waves with expanded wastewater testing sites. Virus surges can be spotted this way. It also plans to look more aggressively for new variants with more genetic testing facilities. What's up to each of us, it now seems, is how to respond when one of these early warning flags goes up. And they will. The virus is now a part of our world. Will we dial up protection such as masks and boosters to stop the spread? That's clearly the response the government policymakers are banking on. And people did that early in the pandemic. But going back to more restricted lives may not sit well with Americans today. Speaking of getting back to normal, you interviewed some historians about how pandemics end, Tanya. What can we learn from previous pandemics about the endgame for COVID?
It's a fascinating question. I talked to John Barry, the historian and author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. The book is an exhaustively reported history of the 1918 influenza, which is believed to have killed at least 50 million people worldwide, and nearly 700,000 in the US alone. I asked Barry how he would define the end of a pandemic, and he said basically the point at which people stop paying attention to it. That seems to be happening already in many places. There is also a scientific component to it when the virus is causing less severe disease and when there is ready access to vaccines and therapeutics. For COVID, we're almost at that point, Barry says, but we don't yet have widespread availability of treatments like Pfizer's antiviral Paxlovid. Ultimately, though, the end of a pandemic is more of a human decision than a biological one. We've clearly wearied as a society, Barry told me, but there's a danger in dropping all precautions too early. Most histories of the 1918 pandemic describe it as having 3 waves: in the spring of 1918, the fall of 1918, and the winter and spring of 1919, finally subsiding in the summer of that year. But in fact, a new flu variant emerged in 1920 that caused a 4th wave that was in some places worse than previous waves, Barry says. Most of the US put in place restrictions during the 2nd wave of that pandemic, and some did for the 3rd. But by the 4th peak in 1920, no cities imposed restrictions. Americans had moved on. Eventually, the disease became milder, in part because most people had some immunity to it from infection, but also because it lost the ability to infect cells in the lungs. There's no law of nature that says a virus has to evolve to be less virulent, Barry says, but over time, our immune system exerted pressure on the virus to make it harder to infect the lungs, similar to what we are seeing with the Omicron variant. Right now, Barry is optimistic. COVID cases have fallen dramatically, and most people have some immunity from vaccination, infection, or both. But that doesn't mean every variant will be mild. There were severe upticks in the flu death toll well after the 1918 pandemic, such as in 1928. Viral evolution is random, so we shouldn't let our guard down just yet, Barry says. Ultimately, it won't be the virus that decides when this pandemic is over. It will be us. Now you're up to speed. Thanks for joining us. Our show is edited by Jeff Del Vicio.
Come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of COVID Quickly. And check out SciAm.com for updated and in-depth COVID news.
Hi, it's Tom. Could we humbly suggest your donation to netrootsradio.com? All we've got to run this 24-hour powerhouse of progressive resistance radio is what comes out of our own wallets. And you are our biggest donor. And it doesn't take much, $3, $5. Just go to the bottom of our netrootsradio.com page and hit our secure donate button. Heck, you can even make a recurring contribution. So donate what you'd like at the bottom of our netrootsradio.com's homepage. Because you are our biggest donor. netrootsradio.com. Together, we are Resistance Radio.
Last July, several GOP senators combined their 5-watt intellects to charge that inflation was rising because of, quote, insane tax and spending spree of President Biden and the Democrats. Never mind that the insane spending is for such sensible, productive, and enormously popular national needs as child care and jobless benefits. Mitch McConnell's rabidly partisan flock saw the chance to politicize the public's legitimate worries about rising prices. You poor consumers are made to pay more for basics, they squawked, because of Socialist Joe's investment in grassroots people. Follow the ricocheting pinball of the GOP's logic. 1, they say that helping hard-hit families induces them to refuse to go to work. 2, this creates blockages in the global supply chain. 3, this causes shortages of everything. 4, this forces corporate bosses to raise all prices, which 5, slams the middle class and poor, so 6, lazy workers cause inflation. Whoa, Rube Goldberg couldn't have dreamed up a more fantastical diagram to deflect attention from what's really happening, namely that instead of an inflation problem, we have a corporate greed problem. Of course, the greedmeisters insist that their pursuit of excess corporate profits has not driven any price surges. In our economy of free market competition, they snap, prices are established by the law of supply and demand. It's the magic of the marketplace, they explain. But magicians don't do magic, they perform illusions. And the illusion of free market competition implodes when it hits the reality that our economy doesn't remotely resemble a competitive marketplace. This is Jim Hightower saying, for some 40 years, corporate-directed government policies have been transforming America into a monopoly nation, letting the few gouge the many. That's where inflation comes from.
Some enslaved women, like Ona Judge, Martha Washington's former servant, managed to escape slavery by running away. Elizabeth Freeman was a rare exception. She took her case to court. In 1773, Mum Bet, as she was known in those days, was held in slavery by Colonel John Ashley of Sheffield, Massachusetts. Ashley was one of the drafters of the Sheffield Declaration, which said that mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other, and have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and property. Similar language could later be found in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Mum Bet had courage and tenacity. she approached one of the men who helped draft the declaration, a lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick, and asked, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are born equal and that every man has a right to freedom. Won't the law give me my freedom?" Sedgwick agreed to take her case to court, where Mum Bet and another enslaved member of the household won their case, 30 shillings in damages, and their freedom in 1781. Mum Bet afterward changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman. This has been 60 Second Civics, a podcast of the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. You may know that March is Women's History Month, but did you know why it takes place each year in the month of March? It all goes back to today in labor history. The year was 1857. That was the day that hundreds of women working in New York City's garment industry went on strike. The women demanded better wages, safer working conditions, a 10-hour workday, and equal rights. In the years that followed the historic strike, March 8th became an important time for women workers to rally in the city. So on March 8th, 1908, a crowd of 15,000 women workers in New York took to the streets. The marching women demanded the right to vote, an end to sweatshops, and a halt to child labor. At the International Socialist Congress in 1910, a German woman named Clara Zetkin proposed March 8th be declared as International Women's Day. Women from 17 countries agreed, and over the years, the day continued to hold a special place for women in the labor movement. Women from Bangladesh to South Africa to Venezuela have held demonstrations for workers and civil rights on this day. By 1980, President Jimmy Carter declared the week surrounding March 8th Women's History Week. His declaration read in part, "Too often, the women were unsung, and sometimes their contributions went unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who built America was as vital as of the men whose names we know so well." In 1987, the week was expanded, and March became known as Women's History Month. And it all started with garment workers who were not afraid to stand up for their rights, leading the way for countless numbers of other women who have bravely followed in their footsteps. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, and follow us on the Twitters at Labor History in 2.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River and the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon, on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 28 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting a high, though, of around 60. With increasing clouds this afternoon, winds will be out of the northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. And cloudy overnight, lows in the mid-30s. Winds will settle down and be light and variable. And tomorrow looks like cloudy skies early will become partly cloudy later in the day. Highs in the low 50s, and the winds will be out of the west-northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Do have rain forecast for the weekend and through the weekend, and quite a bit of it, too. We'll see if that pans out. Confirmed cases of coronavirus in Jackson County in the southern part of Oregon once again continue to increase, even though we're going to be taking off our masks next week. I'm not. We have now risen in confirmed cases to 422,051, and our deceased have also increased. It looks like 6. We now stand at 492 dead. I'm not taking off my mask. I don't care what anyone says. Pollen is rated as none right outside the window in Rogue River proper. The air quality index is good. good at 28 parts per million, and the daytime UV index is in the moderate range at level 3. Barometric pressure is falling at 30.43 inches. Visibility is up to 10 miles, and relative humidity is at 90%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. London is 55 degrees and sunny. Paris is 55 degrees and sunny. Rome is 51 and fair. Kyiv is 30 degrees and mostly cloudy. Hopefully it'll stop the bomb runs, but I don't think so. Kabul is 40 degrees and cloudy. Hong Kong is 56 and clear. Tokyo is 43 and partly cloudy. Sydney, Australia is 65 degrees with heavy rain. San Francisco, California is 55 degrees and sunny. And New York is a crisp 41 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Edith M. Lederer of the Associated Press brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. The United States and 10 other countries yesterday, Monday, condemned North Korea's latest ballistic missile launch and urged the UN Security Council to respond, saying its inaction erodes the credibility of the UN's most powerful body and undermines global efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield read a statement from the 11 countries after a closed Security Council briefing on North Korea's 11th ballistic missile launch since the beginning of the year on Saturday, which was detected by its neighbors. Experts say the launches are an attempt to add new weapon systems to North Korea's arsenal and pressure the United States into making concessions amid stalled diplomacy. The 11 countries, Albania, Australia, Brazil, France, Ireland, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, the UK, and the U.S. said they remain committed to seeking serious and sustained diplomacy with Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the country's official name.
Je te donne, c'est mon amour pour la vie entière. La promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle. C'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer. Mes automnes, quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Matthew Lee of the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken assured Lithuania and Latvia of NATO protection and American support as he made quick visits to two of the three Baltic states that are increasingly on edge as Russia presses ahead with its invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, I'm risking 15 years, Vlad. Along with Estonia, which Blinken will visit today, Tuesday. The former Soviet republics are NATO members, and the Biden administration is aiming to calm any fears they have about their security in the event Russia chooses to expand its military operations. In the Latvian capital of Riga, Blinken and the Baltics have formed a democratic wall that now stands against the tide of autocracy that Russia is pushing in Europe. The United States is more committed than ever to standing with you as our democracies rise to the challenge, Blinken said. We will defend every inch of NATO territory if it comes under attack, he said. No one should doubt our readiness. No one should doubt our resolve. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up tomorrow for, yes, Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and we will meet up here tomorrow, right here, in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théâtres, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Robe à fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair. T'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. Dans mon jardin d'hiver, dans mon jardin d'hiver, dans mon jardin d'hiver.